Good morning, everyone. I am pleased to call today's hearing to order. As you all know, we're here to discuss the state and the federal response to the collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore, Maryland, some 3 months ago. I want to thank our three witnesses for joining us today. I also want to thank Senators Cardin and Van Hollen, who, not surprisingly, have been tireless advocates for their state, our neighboring state. As we all know, the Key Bridge collapsed in the early hours of March 26th, when a cargo ship that had lost power struck one of the bridge's support piers, setting off an all-hands-on-deck response. Our hearts went out then, they go out today to the families, the friends, and the communities of the 6 men who lost their lives while working on the bridge that night. For leaders here in Congress, in the executive branch, and across all levels of government, the collapse of the Key Bridge was a wake-up call. After the collapse of the Key Bridge, it came to light that of the 4,000 bridges in the United States that allow ships to pass under them, two-thirds lack fundamental pier protection. Let me repeat that. Of all the 4,000 bridges in the U.S. that allow ships to pass under them, two-thirds lack functional pier protection. Many of our colleagues have heard me quote Albert Einstein, who used to say, among other things, in adversity lies opportunity. And even in this instance, I think that is true. And I hope that today's hearing will serve as an opportunity for us to discuss the lessons that we've learned from this tragedy and the immediate response to it. We'll also discuss the path that lies ahead to help rebuild the bridge and consider how we can prevent tragedies like this from happening in this country in the future. During today's hearing, we'll explore the efforts to reopen the port and remove debris from the shipping channel. Then we'll assess the effects of the bridge's collapse on Baltimore's communities and its economy. And finally, we'll discuss next steps in the recovery and the rebuilding process. First, though, we're going to examine the response effort that began from the moment that authorities learned that the Dolly had lost its steering capabilities. As many of you will recall, before the bridge fell, emergency responders acted quickly to close the bridge to additional traffic, saving lives by keeping vehicles off the bridge, probably saving many lives. Within hours, the Coast Guard and the Army Corps of Engineers took steps to protect the people on board the vessel and to prevent further damage. Working hand in glove, the federal, state, and local agencies then stabilized the remaining structural pieces of the bridge and cleared debris from the shipping channel. Thanks in no small part to the expert work of the Unified Command, the Port of Baltimore was fully reopened in 2 months. We talk about miracles, I think that's one of them. Along with a group of local, state, and federal leaders, including General Spellman, who's here today, the governor and lieutenant governor of Maryland, and members of our staffs, I recently visited the Key Bridge. During the visit, we learned more about the incredible work that has gone into the recovery and salvage efforts to date. I also had the opportunity to thank a number of the federal, state, and local leaders who worked together to immediately and effectively respond to this disaster. We're deeply grateful to the men and women who risked their lives during this operation and worked literally around the clock to reopen the channel. In light of the success, I want to commend our witnesses here today. I also want to commend Colonel Esty, and I will always screw up this name, Esty Penchason. Is she here? Is she here? Okay, all right. Give her our best. Commander of the Baltimore District. She's demonstrated remarkable leadership throughout this disaster response. And maybe by the time it's all over, we'll get her name correctly pronounced, and I'll be one of those. Next, we will assess the impact of the collapse that has had on Baltimore's communities, on Baltimore's economy. Thousands of people have had their lives disrupted, and the economic impacts of this disaster is still being felt across Baltimore, and my guess is throughout the state of Maryland. Prior to its collapse, more than 30,000 vehicles traveled over the Key Bridge every day, 30,000. Many of the trucks carrying cargo in and out of the Port of Baltimore had to be rerouted onto roads in nearby neighborhoods, which has worsened air quality in surrounding communities, you might imagine. As the response efforts continue, it's essential that we address the far-reaching effects of this disaster on the city and on the region. And finally, with debris removal nearly complete and the federal channel back in full operation, much of the work remaining to be done will now focus on rebuilding the bridge. Planning efforts are still underway, and rebuilding the bridge will be an immense effort that will very likely require continued collaboration between state, federal, and local agencies for years to come. Rebuilding the bridge is also expected to be a large financial undertaking. President Biden has, we all know, has committed the resources of the federal government to help Maryland rebuild. With that said, Administrator Bott testified before this committee just last month that the proceeds of insurance payments and other future claims will be used to reimburse the federal government for a considerable portion of the cost of rebuilding the bridge. Today's hearing probably could not have come at a more opportune time. The President has just submitted a supplemental appropriation request to the Congress. $3.1 billion in emergency response funding that the President requested for the Department of Transportation would support efforts to address this disaster and a number of other disasters that have not yet received assistance. That includes a major mudslide in Jackson, Wyoming, as well as tragic losses in Maui last year and other recent disasters across our country. Passing the supplemental appropriation bill will be the most expedient path to address not only the needs of Baltimore, but also the needs of a number of other states awaiting assistance. Closing, let me just add that I believe that when all levels of government work together to safeguard and invest in our infrastructure, it makes our communities better, stronger, and safer. And I believe that it is our shared responsibility to make these investments. There's no doubt that we still have significant work ahead of us to continue to build and rebuild the infrastructure that America will need for the 21st century. We look forward to hearing from our witnesses about the coordinated response to the events that transpired on March the 26th and the work that still lies ahead to rebuild the Key Bridge. And before that, turn to our ranking member, Senator Capito. Before she shares her thoughts with us, let me just acknowledge Delaware and Maryland are neighbors. There's something called the Delmarva Peninsula. We're joined at the hip from north to south in our part. And the question is, how should we treat our neighbors? And we ought to treat our neighbors the way we would want to be treated, and if they're in their shoes. And we'll try to do that as best we can. But this is a shared responsibility. Try to make sure that those other states I mentioned, Maui, I mentioned Hawaii, I mentioned Wyoming, the other states that are facing great difficulties and turmoils and disruption because of their own disasters. We want to make sure that we're fair to them and treat them, even though they're not our neighbors necessarily. We want to make sure that we treat them fairly. Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for calling this hearing today to examine the response to the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse and the lessons learned in the efforts to rebuild the new bridge. I want to thank my colleagues for being here. I know when something like this occurs in your state is very deeply felt, and I'm sure we'll hear that through your statements and certainly private conversations that we've had as well. I will say Maryland is also a neighbor of West Virginia, but we're kind of on the western side there. Before I proceed with my opening remarks, I do want to acknowledge the passing of our former chairman, Jim Inhofe, this week, and express my sincere condolences to his family. He sat in this chair, and I sat very close to him. Senator Inhofe was a true public servant, a workhorse for the people of Oklahoma, and the embodiment of kindness and leadership for all who knew him. He was also, as we know, those of us who have been to the prayer breakfasts on Wednesday mornings, a very spiritual man at the same time and a family man. As chairman of the committee, he developed a strong tradition of tackling the nation's infrastructure in a bipartisan and thoughtful manner, a tradition that sent many bills to the president's desk for signature. So I'm pleased that this committee has continued his tradition.
I'm Tom Carper, and I approve this message.
Oh. Turning to the topic of today's hearing, I want to say how impressed I was, and I've said this publicly just about every time I've talked about the bridge, and the chairman talked about this, the rapid and professional response to the Key Bridge collapse from everybody, from federal, state, and local agencies. I also want to extend my condolences to the families of the 6 folks who unfortunately lost their lives that day. We are grateful that the quick action to close the bridge to traffic prevented further loss of life, and that the response and recovery efforts began almost immediately thereafter. The salvage effort to remove the debris from the collapsed bridge and refloat the galley was a massive undertaking and amazingly quick. In total, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, in coordination with the U.S. Navy Supervisor of Salvage and Diving, cleared more than 50,000 tons of debris from the river. The Corps' effective management of these operations allowed for the establishment of limited capacity channels, while a team of experts worked to clear the river and restore a critical component of our supply chain, of which West Virginia coal was on the other side, uses the port quite frequently for exports. On June 10th, the Corps announced the restoration of the federal channel and its original dimensions of 70 foot wide by 50 feet deep for commercial navigation, which enabled operations to resume at the Port of Baltimore. General Spellman, thank you for your leadership on this matter. I understand, and we just talked briefly, that your time with the Corps of Engineers is coming to an end here shortly, and I want to express my sincere gratitude for your service to our country and your dedication to addressing our nation's infrastructure and our challenges ahead. On the highway side, the Federal Highway Administration dispersed $60 million in quick release funding from the emergency or ER program, relief program, within 2 days of the collapse, so that the Maryland Department of State of Transportation would have federal resources to help with the agency's recovery efforts. Federal Highways has also been lending its broad technical expertise to Maryland DOT to help get the project for the new bridge underway. Through the ER program, the federal government plays a key role in helping state DOTs repair highways and bridges that have been damaged by natural disasters and other emergencies. Currently, the ER program itself is drastically short of the funding necessary for all of the eligible projects. As of June 25th, the current funding shortfall stands at $3.5 billion, with a backlog of 38 states and territories that have more than 130 eligible events, and the chairman spoke about several of those. Ensuring adequate funding for the ER program is vastly important to helping communities recover from these events and restore connections in our supply chain. Moreover, the Highway Trust Fund, which provides contract authority for certain surface transportation programs, will face another funding shortfall, according to the Congressional Budget Office. Specifically, the CBO estimates that the Highway Trust Fund's shortfall is more than $284 billion over the 10-year budget window. So you see where we are. This amount does not account for the prudent cash cushions that are always recommended by the U.S. Department of Transportation. The committee will have to contend with the Highway Trust Fund shortfall when we begin our work on the next Surface Transportation Reauthorization Bill, which will begin probably at the beginning of next year. In the meantime, the Biden administration transmitted an additional supplemental appropriations request to Congress, which builds on their request from last fall. I expect that Congress will need to consider a supplemental appropriations bill to address the funding shortfall of the ER program and other pressing needs in the coming months. As part of that legislation, I expect that Congress will have to consider the extent to which statutory cost share requirements for any ER projects should be changed. In general, an ER project has a federal cost share of either 80% or 90% based on the type of highway or bridge that is being repaired. My colleague, Senator Cardin, has introduced a bill that would provide 100% federal funding to replace the Key Bridge. I want to raise just a couple of issues, and we'll probably get this into the questions, that I think Congress should consider as it evaluates whether 100% federal cost share is appropriate for this particular project. The Key Bridge was a revenue-generating asset with more than $56 million in toll revenue collected in the year of 2023. My understanding is that Maryland DOT intends for the new bridge to also be a tolled facility, which means that there is a source of funding for Maryland's DOT 10% cost share. In fact, this funding model was successfully used to construct the Fort McHenry Tunnel in Baltimore, Maryland. The federal government advanced Maryland its required 10%, and Maryland reimbursed the federal government with revenue from the tunnel's tolls over time. As I mentioned earlier in my statement, there are many important projects that are currently on the ER backlog list. Congress should determine an equitable basis for when ER projects should receive a greater share of federal funding than when is allowed under the program's statute. If Congress does not require Maryland to share in the cost of a project like the replacement of the Key Bridge, which will have a revenue source, how can Congress require any other recipient of ER program funding to pay their cost share? I look forward to gathering information and feedback from our witnesses on this matter. I'm also eager to hear about any updates on the status of the Maryland DOT's effort to reconstruct the bridge, including any new updates on cost estimates and scope of the project, given that responses to the agency's request for proposals were due last month. And I look forward to learning more about how Maryland DOT plans to deliver this project and whether the agency will be able to utilize any existing authorities to expedite the environmental review and the permitting process. So I thank our witnesses for being here, and I thank you, Chairman, for having us.
Thank you, Senator Capito. We've invited several of our colleagues, a couple of our colleagues from Maryland, Senator Cardin and Senator Van Hollen, to also make opening statements this day. Senator Cardin, as you'll recall, is a senior member of this committee, former chairman of the Transportation Infrastructure Subcommittee. Senator Cardin, welcome. You are recognized.
Chairman Carper, thank you very much. Senator Capito, thank you for holding this hearing and for the courtesy of being able to testify. I want to also comment in regards to Jim Inhofe. We were elected together in 1986, so we were in the same class in the House of Representatives. And we became close friends in the House and close friends in the Senate. I admired him greatly for his integrity and his passion. The line I liked the most about what he would say is that a true conservative, as he was clearly, supports more money for infrastructure. So he was the great chairman of this committee, so I thank you for that. And it's good to be here with Senator Van Hollen. I know we're far apart at this dais, but believe me, we are working and joined at the hip in regards to this issue and issues affecting Maryland. So March 26th was a tragic shock day for all of us in Maryland. I was awoken early in the morning and looked at the video and was shocked by how quickly the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapsed after being struck by the dolly. The loss of life was our major concern trying to rescue. We lost 6 people that tragedy, and their thoughts are always in our prayers, and we are always with their families. The Port of Baltimore was closed. The third busiest port in the United States, closed as a result of the tragedy. The next morning, workers had no place to go to work. Hundreds and thousands of people were directly impacted by the Port of Baltimore being closed. Businesses were shuttered. Small business operators had no business. It was a major catastrophic event for our economy. And by the way, it affected the entire region. Small Business Administration was there, setting up an office immediately, affecting businesses in 6 states. So it was affected in the entire region of our country. In fact, it affected the entire country because the supplies of a lot of the agricultural and roll-off cargo was affected throughout our country. It shut down a major artery of I-95. As the chairman pointed out, over 30,000 vehicles a day. I want to just first acknowledge the incredible unified response, starting with the President of the United States, President Biden. He was very direct about the federal response, and he was very helpful to all of us. I want to thank Administrator Batt and Secretary Buttigieg. They were there immediately, providing the expertise and resources, as Senator Capito pointed out. $60 million was released almost immediately to deal with the cleanup operations of the bridge itself. I want to thank General Spellman and Colonel Pinchason. I must tell you, I knew that they were good. I didn't know that they were this good. You're talking about, as Senator Capito said, 50,000 tons of debris, and it was highly contained. So therefore, when you started to try to remove anything, you would have a spring effect that could very well have caused additional injury and damage and death. And they couldn't see it all in the water. They had to use sonar in order to figure out where things were. The expertise was unbelievable, and the response was unbelievable. I want to thank the U.S. Coast Guard. They were the head of the Unified Command. They did an incredible, keeping all of the people working in the same direction. And Secretary Wiedefeld, our Secretary of the Department of Transportation, along with Governor Moore and Baltimore City Mayor Scott, all worked as a unified team in order to deal with the challenges of the families of the victims, to deal with the businesses that were shuttered, to deal with the workers, to deal with the port issues, and to deal with the replacement of the bridge. So, and as the chairman pointed out, our incredible thanks go out to our first responders. It is almost unbelievable to believe we only lost 6 lives. The quick action of the first responders kept other vehicles from being on the bridge. And we're talking about seconds. It's all there was between the original alert and the bridge coming down, and they were able to prevent other cars from going on to the bridge, saving many lives. Now, in regards to the bridge replacement, we have a major issue. The city streets are being now inundated by truck traffic. We've seen an 18% increase in the tunnel traffic, which is causing major delays through our tunnels. For hazardous materials and those who choose to take the detour around the Beltway, it's a 25-mile detour through a part of the Beltway that already was congested with major delays, now having even more major delays. So make no mistake about it, there's a serious impact until that bridge is replaced, and it's going to take a couple years, we recognize that. But we need to act quickly. That's why Senator Van Hollen and I filed legislation to the Bridge Relief Act because we need to know the certainty of the federal share. And let me just point out, we are asking for the 100% because that's what we've done in the past. And we need it now because we are lending contracts to start the construction now. We don't want to delay this. Every month it's delayed is additional loss to our communities and frustration among drivers, not only those that are directly impacted by the port, but those that are using our streets. It is neighborhoods are impacted, so we need to get this moving as quickly as possible. I point out that changing the share to 100% is totally consistent with the prior practices that we've done during emergencies. We did that for the I-35W bridge in Minnesota. We did it for Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Maria, Hurricane Fiona. All those, we changed the share from 90% to 100%. Why? Because it was a major event. Senator Van Hollen and I, the Maryland delegation, strongly supported our efforts on behalf of our sister state problems, and we expect that we'll get the same courtesy in reply. Let me also point out that it's supported by the administration. Director Young has sent a letter to us supporting this. Let me mention the issue in regards to the toll issue, because Senator Capito mentioned that. The toll issues in regards to this facility is totally consistent with the requirements in Title 23. The toll revenues are not used to build a replacement bridge for Francis Scott Key Bridge. It is used for the maintenance of our interstate system. It's already taken a major hit as a result of Francis Scott Key Bridge being knocked down. We've lost literally millions of dollars of revenues already, and we're behind in the resources we would normally get. This is not being used for the replacement of the bridge. Secondly, there will be recoveries. We put that in the legislation. They're expecting a record recovery from insurance and third-party claims, and that will be used to reduce dramatically the federal share. Now, the state of Maryland, all those funds go to the federal government. It would be penalizing the state of Maryland if you required us to use our toll facilities to repay our 10%. So we think that would be totally unfair. And I just have to be pretty honest about that. I think it'd be penalizing our state. Yes, I support the supplemental. We need to get the ER funds up to where it needs to be. We strongly support that. But let's be realistic. That's going to take some time before we get around to doing it. I would ask your support the first available vehicle for us to be able to get the cost share legislation passed. I think that's a matter of fairness and importance for us to be able to move forward with this project. And with that, I'm glad to be here with my colleague. We're going to work together, and we're going to certainly work with the chair and ranking member and all the members of this committee in order that we can get this project done as quickly as possible.
Senator Cardin, thank you for those words. Before I recognize Senator Van Hollen, I'm going to go back to Jim Inhofe. And Jim Inhofe, for those who remember, was I don't mean this in an unkind way, he was a climate change denier. And there's famously one of the most memorable things he did when, I don't know, it was like springtime, and we had like a big snowfall here. And he went out and gathered snow in front of the U.S. Capitol and made snowballs and brought them in to the chamber and said, you know, for those of you who think that, you know, this climate change is real, look at all these snowballs. He ended up, at the time that he was here, joining me as initially George Wanevich, Republican from Ohio, but later Jim Inhofe to be the co-chairman, the co-sponsor for the Diesel Emission Reduction Act, which has done a whole lot to reduce diesel emissions and help us in the battle on climate change. So God bless Jim Inhofe. Thank you. Chris, welcome, Chris Van Hollen, who is, I think, if I'm not mistaken, previously a valued member of this committee. And we're grateful that you can join us this morning, and you're not recognized. Go ahead, please. And at some point in time, maybe right after Senator Van Hollen, I need to run over to the Homeland Security Committee. We're having a hearing on permitting, which my colleagues know is a big deal for all of us, and so I'll have to slip out for a part of that.
When you step out, can I take the chair and move my legislation forward?
I'll second that.
No. Go right ahead, Chris.
Thank you, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito. Thank you both for remembering Senator Inhofe. Thank both of you for being great neighbors of Maryland, literally. Delaware to the east, West Virginia to our west. And thank you not only for being good geographic neighbors, but being good neighbors in spirit and working together. As Senator Cardin indicated, that we have a tradition in the country of considering every state a neighbor, whether or not they're geographically connected. I want to thank Senator Ricketts for being here and other members of the committee. That is the approach we've taken, that we're one country, and when one state has an emergency of this kind of impact and consequence, we're all neighbors, whether we're geographically connected or not, because we're all Americans. And I do encourage the committee to continue to work in that spirit. Senator Carper, I do have a little bone to pick with you, which is that yesterday, the state of Delaware, I think it was yesterday, made Orange Crush their official state cocktail. I just want to remember, my friend, that it was made famous, Orange Crush, on another part of the Eastern Shore, Ocean City. But Senator Cardin and I are willing to forgive this transgression by the state of Delaware, since you're cooperating with us as a good neighbor on other issues.
It's fair. I don't know if that's a fair trade, but we'll see.
Let me just say, with Senator Cardin here, he's been a great captain of Team Maryland. We've seen him at work here in response to the tragedy of the collapse of the Key Bridge. He's brought us together on a bipartisan basis. Every member of the Maryland delegation, including representatives from the Eastern Shore to Western Maryland, are backing the legislation that we've been introduced. And it's just the latest example of his leadership. So I do just want to take this opportunity before the committee that he has served on so honorably and well to thank my partner, Senator Cardin, for his leadership of the Maryland delegation, and we're seeing it in action right here. And we all, every one of us from Maryland, are sponsoring the Baltimore Bridge Relief Act. And I know I will cover some of the same things that have already been mentioned, but I do think these points are worth emphasizing, because for 47 years, the Key Bridge in Baltimore has been an iconic and indelible part of our landscape and our psychiatry and psychology, I should say. It's also a vital transportation artery for the region. More than 34,000 travelers that crossed it every single day, and as Senator Cardin has mentioned, the impact of its collapse is being felt dramatically in terms of congestion in the region. As the country has learned, it was also the gateway to the Port of Baltimore, which welcomes 1,800 ships every day and and generates tens of thousands of jobs. I think the country learned that it is the busiest port in America for automobiles, light trucks, farm and construction machinery, imported forest products, aluminum, and sugar. $70 billion of economic activity per year. So its collapse shook the world. It was a tragedy for our country, and first and foremost, it was a human tragedy. We did lose those 6 individuals, 6 souls that day who were working the overnight shift on Key Bridge. They each had loved ones who depended upon them. 4 of them were fathers, and we've been working ever since to support those families, and we want to thank the committee and the country, and of course, in our state, all those who are working to do that. And then, as you mentioned, Senator Capito and Senator Carper, huge chunks of debris went into the channel, blocking the ships, putting 8,000 people out of work temporarily, impacting and harming small businesses and others who depend for their economic livelihood on the Port of Baltimore. And it deprived the region of that key transportation link, and this is why we're so urgently seeking support for the new bridge. What we have seen is that as the bridge fell apart, we came together as a delegation in the country. I, too, want to thank all those who were recognized earlier, from the first responders who helped save additional lives, to the unified command that quickly came together, both the federal officials and the state officials. President Biden did reach out personally to myself and Senator Cardin and the governor, Governor Moore, and others, and quickly ordered the federal government to use all parts of our power to support the Baltimore and Maryland in this hour of need. I do also want to mention specifically the folks at the Army Corps. General Spellman, thank you for your efforts in terms of clearing the channel in such fast time. And Colonel Esty Pinchason has been mentioned. I also want to thank her. She's retiring from this particular spot, going on to another one, but I want to recognize her efforts as well. Secretary Wiedefeld is here, and he's been working very closely with Secretary Buttigieg, and I want to thank them. As you know, we were enrolled in the emergency relief program, and as Senator Capito mentioned, and Senator Carper, you're well aware, as other committees, we now have about 38 states that are subscribed to that program, and we all have a common interest in making sure that it is fully replenished. That covers 90% of the costs, but Senator Cardin and I introduced the legislation we did with our delegation because it has been a tradition in the United States of America of providing 100% support for states that have undergone this kind of tragedy. We have been there for other states during their times of need, and we really hope every state represented in the Senate will be with us right now. I want to, in closing, just emphasize a point that Senator Cardin made, and it's written into the bill. It was already current law, but we made it very explicit that the federal government will receive, and I quote, any compensation for damages or insurance proceeds, including interest, recovered by a state, a political subdivision of a state, or a toll authority for repair, including reconstruction of the bridge. Colleagues, the emergency supplemental that the President submitted, of course, includes emergency help for replacing the Key Bridge. It also, as you've mentioned, includes funds to help other states from Hawaii to the far west to the south that have been impacted by these huge disasters where one state is simply just not capable of meeting all the costs, which is why we came together as a country in the past to help those states in need. It's Maryland today, maybe Hawaii today. It could, of course, be any other state tomorrow. And we thank you for all your efforts to make sure that we continue that tradition. Thank you.
Senator Inhofe, thank you. Our thanks to both of you for your service on this committee in the past and certainly to today. With that in mind, we're going to excuse both of you. And I'm going to ask Shaylin Bott to come forward as our first witness, our next witness. And Shaylin, if you'll have a seat. There we go. And our other witnesses as well. Our next witness to speak is Shaylin Bott, no stranger to this committee, no stranger to us in Delaware either. Shaylin is the administrator of the Federal Highway Administration. He has served as Federal Highway Administrator since January 13th, 2023. Prior to his current role, he served as Deputy Executive Director of the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet. He also served as the Executive Director of the Colorado Department of Transportation and the Secretary of the Delaware Department of Transportation. He brings a wealth of expertise and experience in government as well as in the private sector. We are grateful for his service and his participation this morning. Shaylin, welcome. And you're recognized. I'm going to slip out to participate in my Homeland Security Government Affairs committee hat, and I'll be back very shortly. Senator Capito, thanks very much. You're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, and members of the committee for the opportunity to appear before you today. I do also want to join you and your colleagues in remembering Senator Inhofe. I have fond memories of meeting with him prior to my confirmation, appreciated his support. Just over 3 months ago, Baltimore, Maryland, and the entire nation were shocked by the collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge. While the collapse of the bridge itself was distressing, we remember the devastating impact this tragedy had on victims and their families. The 6 victims were fathers, husbands, and friends in their homes and communities, and they were valued members of the construction workforce. We will always mourn these individuals who gave their lives to strengthen our transportation system. I also want to thank all of the emergency responders who acted quickly to save lives. Immediately following this catastrophic event, the Federal Highway Administration mobilized internally across multiple offices and externally with local, state, and federal partners to support the response. Under Secretary Buttigieg's leadership, FHWA coordinated with other operating administrations and offices within USDOT, the Maryland DOT, which includes the Maryland Transportation Authority and State Highway Administration, the City of Baltimore, U.S. Coast Guard, Army Corps of Engineers, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and others to mitigate supply chain impacts, manage traffic, and safely reopen the port. We remain engaged in an ongoing coordination with local, state, and federal partners in the response. FHWA is actively supporting the National Transportation Safety Board's investigation of the collapse. FHWA's focus now is supporting Maryland as much as possible as they work to reconstruct the bridge. We've been in direct communication with MDOT regarding all possible options for building the bridge, and we are committed to supporting these efforts so that the bridge can be reconstructed as quickly and safely as possible. President Biden has been clear in this administration's commitment to reconstruct the bridge. It is critical that we restore this vital connection for people and goods traveling along the East Coast. Ensuring that the I-695 corridor is open, operational, and safe for the traveling public at the earliest possible moment is a top priority. On March 28th, within hours of receiving the request for funding assistance from MDOT, we announced the immediate availability of $60 million in quick-release emergency relief funds. These funds serve as a down payment toward initial costs, and additional ER program funding will be made available as the work continues. As of July 3rd, 2024, $40 million of this $60 million down payment has been obligated for debris removal work. The administration is asking Congress to join it in demonstrating a commitment to aid in recovery efforts by authorizing a 100% federal cost share for rebuilding the bridge, consistent with past catastrophic bridge collapses. Under the law, ER funds cannot duplicate assistance from another federal program or compensation from insurance or other sources. FHWA will follow the law, and the emergency relief program will be reimbursed with compensation for damages or with proceeds obtained through applicable insurance. We are coordinating closely with the state of Maryland as it works through the details of its insurance policy. We continue to provide wide-ranging technical assistance to Maryland DOT regarding procurement for reconstruction, operations, and project delivery strategies to reconstruct the bridge quickly. The MTA issued a progressive design-build contract request for proposals on May 31st. FHWA is also working with MDOT to ensure that the new bridge will be built to current design standards and in accordance with all applicable federal laws. On March 26, 2024, the day of the collapse, FHWA met with the National Transportation Liaisons from the Army Corps of Engineers, U.S. Coast Guard, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, and the APA to discuss each agency's respective emergency procedures. We continue to meet with federal and state agencies. A categorical exclusion for the replacement of the bridge is expected to be completed shortly, and will provide the appropriate level of information to allow for a streamlined permitting approach. Thanks to the whole of government response and industry and government entities working together, there's been significant progress, including the significant milestone of reopening the federal channel on June 2024. While there is more work to be done, the coordinated response by the government and industry to date gives me great optimism. Thank you to the state, local, and federal entities who continue to collaborate with FHWA in response to this tragic event. We've had a number of bridge events while I've been serving as administrator. I am proud of the efforts that we have led and worked with local agencies on. We'll continue to do everything we can to support the response. As the President has said, we will not rest until the cement has dried on the entirety of the new bridge. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Thank you. And Administrator Bott, and our second witness is Lieutenant General Scott Spellman, who has been serving as the 55th Chief of Engineers and Commanding General of the Army Corps of Engineers since September of 2020. Prior to that, he served as the Deputy Commanding General for Civil and Emergency Operations. He is no stranger to the Corps' Civil Works program or to this committee. Again, we're grateful for your service and look forward to your testimony, General. Thank you.
Ranking Member Capito and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today to discuss emergency response operations by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and our partners regarding the collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge. On behalf of the Corps and our teammates, please allow me also to begin today by offering again our heartfelt condolences to the families of the 6 individuals who lost their lives in this tragedy. From the outset of this response, we were committed to supporting the effort to recover those loved ones. Our thoughts and prayers continue to be with those families. Soon after the collapse, Maryland Governor Moore declared a state of emergency, and our U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Baltimore District, under the leadership of Colonel Esty Pinchason, whose name has been mentioned several times this morning, she activated the district's Emergency Operations Center and put her team in motion. Our state-of-the-art survey vessels, which usually serve to verify depths and widths of our federal channels, were deployed to support initial search and rescue dive operations. Our support evolved as we joined a multi-agency effort across all levels of government to form a unified command. I've been a part of numerous disaster response operations over the past 9 years in my time in the Corps, and this unified team, led by U.S. Coast Guard Rear Admiral Shannon Gilreath and Captain David O'Connell, is one of the best I've seen. They are amazing leaders. The guidance from the President to me was clear from the beginning. He called me early on the morning of March 26 and told me the Corps' top priority, number one priority, was to remove the wreckage from the Federal Navigation Channel and get it reopened. We had 3 tools at our disposal to move fast and execute this mission. We had the right authority, the right funding, and the right contracting capacity. We used our existing authority for the Baltimore Harbor and Channel project. In 1970, Congress authorized the Army Corps to construct and maintain a 700-foot wide by 50-foot deep channel at the bridge location. The full navigation channel was, of course, fully blocked by the wreckage of the Key Bridge. To get started that morning, we used available fiscal year 23 and 24 operations and maintenance funding for the Baltimore Harbor and Channel project. Later, to advance our work, we conducted a series of internal emergency reprogramming actions using authority given to us by Congress, where we put to work aged and unused funding from 220 Harbor and Maintenance Trust Fund O&M projects across the country. And the third tool was our contract capacity. We are fortunate to have a standing interagency agreement with the U.S. Navy Supervisor of Salvage and Diving, and I cannot say enough positive words about these incredible men and women from the U.S. Navy and their industry partners. They are true world-class professionals, and they are very good at what they do. Each have an amazing experiences, expertise, and a suite of contracting tools that gave us access to superb salvage companies. In this case, that contractor is Don John Marine from Newark, New Jersey. With these three tools in place, we began the complex task of determining how to begin clearing approximately 50,000 tons of concrete, asphalt, and steel from the Patapsco River. And for everyone's context, that's equivalent to over 200 Statues of Liberty worth of material. After conducting extensive diving and engineering analysis, in collaboration with our partners, we developed an ambitious but feasible timeline. Our plan was to initially clear a 35-foot deep by 280-foot wide limited access channel by the end of April, and then restore the full 50-foot federal navigation channel by the end of May. Certified by the Coast Guard, the limited access channel was open to one-way vessel traffic on April 25th, a week ahead of schedule, and this channel could support approximately 70% of the vessels, the port traffic, calling on the Port of Baltimore. To reopen the full channel, we had to execute the most difficult task, which was removing the section of bridge that collapsed onto the bow of the vessel Dolly. For this task, the team successfully used precision demolitions to cut the bridge away from the ship and move the Dolly from the edge of the federal navigation channel. This allowed for the removal of the remaining bridge wreckage and residual material in the channel well below the mudline. We moved as quickly and safely as possible, and on June 10th, the Corps of Engineers successfully restored the federal channel to its original depth and width, again, of 700 feet wide and 50 foot deep. Today, no steel or concrete remains in the federal channel. All wreckage was removed, and the collapsed bridge area was cleared down in some cases to a 60-foot depth. I am proud to say our debris removal mission has ended, and the Port of Baltimore navigation channel has returned to its authorized dimensions. And then ending, on behalf of the more than 39,000 men and women of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and all of our federal, state, and industry partners, I want to say we are tremendously proud to have been a part of the unified team that undertook this incredible task. Thank you again, Ranking Member Capito and members of the committee. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, General Spellman. And last but not least is Secretary Paul Wiedefeld, who serves as the Secretary of the Maryland Department of Transportation. He was sworn in as Secretary on March 2nd, 2023, and has had a 40-year career in the public and private sectors. Secretary Wiedefeld, I think I said that wrong. Wiedefeld, excuse me, previously served as the General Manager and CEO of the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority, the CEO of the Baltimore-Washington Thurgood Marshall Airport, and as Administrator of the Maryland Transit Administration. We welcome you and look forward to your testimony. Thank you.
Good morning, Ranking Member Capito and members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity, obviously, to discuss the ongoing response to the collapse of the Key Bridge. Before I address the subject, I also want to take a moment to express our condolences, obviously, to the families and their relatives. As the day-to-day operator of the transit system, the transportation system in Maryland, everyone at MDOT takes this personally. These are our co-workers who lost their lives. I also want to thank our partners in the federal government who have worked hand in hand with us to immediately respond to the disaster by helping clear the debris and reopening the channel to the Port of Baltimore in tremendous record time. I also want to thank the administration for the immediate provision of $60 million in emergency relief funds. Those funds proved invaluable in performing the crucial first steps in clearing the auxiliary channels of the Port of Baltimore. Difficult times call for resolve and unified responses, and I'm encouraged by the way all levels of government have rallied to address this crisis. The collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge is not only a human tragedy, but also an economic disaster. The economic effects of the bridge will be felt nationwide until the bridge is rebuilt. This bridge is a key component of the I-95 corridor and is essential to the free flow of needed commerce and vehicle transit. It serves as a vital connection for the people and goods traveling throughout the entire East Coast and nation. Efficiently rebuilding the bridge to meet the future needs of the commerce is a national imperative. It is crucial to restoring jobs, protecting essential supply chain, and reducing inflation nationwide. It is key to ensuring efficient freight movement on the nationally significant I-95 corridor, which generates roughly 40% of the nation's GDP. This effort will require clear direction, assured funding, and continuation of widespread bipartisan support at all levels of government. For this reason, I'm urging you to support the enactment of legislation introduced by the Maryland Congressional Delegation, the Baltimore Bridge Relief Act. This legislation will ensure that the federal government supports 100% of the replacement costs of the vital bridge. Additionally, this legislation specifies that funds recovered from insurance proceeds and culpable parties will be applied to reduce the costs ultimately borne by the federal government. These sums are expected to be substantial. This funding approach parallels the action the federal government has taken to respond to other disasters that require immediate, focused response and dwarf the capabilities of state and local governments. The federal government often intervenes after major disasters to pay for the upfront costs of disasters while pursuing recovery actions against insurance companies and culpable parties. The collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge is a national problem, and promptly and effectively repairing it would require clear and focused action by the federal government. Preliminary estimates indicate the bridge replacement will cost approximately $1.7 billion. We are moving expeditiously to rebuild the bridge. The Maryland Transportation Authority is currently evaluating requests for proposals for a design-build team. We expect to have a project team selected by mid to late summer with a projected project completion date of fall of 2028. In conclusion, I urge Congress to approve the Baltimore Bridge Relief Act and to continue the custom of providing support when it is needed most following disasters. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. So I'll recognize myself for the first question. And I think this really is the question. Senator Cardin's bill is probably in exactly the same bill that I would put in if it happened in the state of West Virginia. Same in Nebraska. The cost share issue, I think, is where we have a question. So I think that we just need to get the answers here. So I'm going to start with you, Administrator Batt. As I mentioned in my opening statement, there's a significant backlog of emergency relief that are waiting on federal funding. And the chairman mentioned the one most recent that we all recall is certainly what happened in Maui with the fire. Many of these projects will have a 10 or 20% cost share that will be provided by a state DOT. So I think Congress needs to have a basis for determining when to waive the statutory cost share for ER projects so that there is an equitable response to natural disasters and other emergencies. The Secretary just said other disasters have had this waived, but we know the key is not every disaster has had this waived. So what factors do you think Congress should consider when reducing the required cost share for an ER project?
Thank you, Ranking Member Capito, for that question. I think it is a fair question to ask, and I think that when you look at some of the examples, both that Senator Cardin has mentioned or that we've used in the past, I think it is scope and scale of a disaster that would, as Secretary Wiedefeld just mentioned, overwhelm state and local agencies' ability to respond. So in Delaware, when we had our bridge disaster, when I served as secretary, it was in the tens of millions of dollars, and it was something that financially we were grateful for the Federal Highway Administration, but it was not a debilitating impact to our state economy had we had to have come up with $10 or $20 million. But in the case of a $1.7 billion bridge replacement with corresponding loss of toll funding that has impacts on their transportation program, I think that's where you get into a scope and scale sense of where the federal government may need to come in, because the 10 or 20% cost share becomes a quite sizable number at that point.
Okay, so scope and scale. All right, so then I want to go to you, Secretary Wiedefeld, and thank you for the phone call that we had. I appreciate that early on, and just amazed at the efforts that you all have done in Maryland, along, I know, with a lot of help. So congratulations on that, and I know there's a big way to go. You mentioned possible cost of the bridge would be $1.7 billion. So if you take out insurance and any other kind of legal cost, we don't really know what it would be, but let's just say, what was the insurance? It was 400?
350.
350, let's just say you match that with insurance. That'd be good, wouldn't it? So get it down to $1 billion, which is still quite heavy. Then a cost share for Maryland could be possibly $100 million. The bridge, and I mentioned this in my statement because I want to understand, and you explained this to me on the phone call that we had previously, and Ben and I have talked about this as well. The $56 million that you collect on that bridge is used for the maintenance and upkeep of all of the projects in the state, correct? Not, I mean, the tunnels and that bridge. And so it's not exclusively dedicated to that bridge, correct?
Correct. Is for the Transportation Authority, which runs all of our toll facilities only, not the general highway system.
Okay. So if you took, say, a 30-year payback plan to the federal government for the 10%, you would be taking probably a 10% off of that toll revenue that the state of Maryland could use if the cost share that exists now could use to pay back the American taxpayer the cost of the rebuild of the bridge, right?
You could,
If that,
sure, if that was,
yeah, if that was the direction that we decided to go. So the other question I have is, if you have a new bridge, which you will have, hopefully sooner than some of the projections, but I realize it's a major undertaking. If you have a new bridge, is it safe to assume that a new bridge demand on the toll revenues would be less for maintenance and upkeep?
not necessarily. I mean, the operations is also a big part of the cost, just the ongoing operations, meaning policing and things of that sort, cleaning, keeping things, you know.
So there's a
clear and safe.
standard cost?
Yeah.
I mean, my assumption
Whether it's
is
new or
that a
old, you're
60-year-old bridge is going to cost more than a brand-new one,
yeah, for ongoing maintenance.
For ongoing
For
maintenance.
future maintenance, yes.
which is what the dedication of the tolls is for as well. So is it unreasonable to assume that, and I know we're making assumptions that the bridge that, I think it was in Minnesota, got the 100% cost share when it collapsed. It was not a toll bridge. You're going to put the tolls back on when this is completed. You've pretty much stated that. I think the state of Maryland is going to do that, which I would do that too if I was the state of Maryland, so I'm not being critical of that. Why is it wrong to assume, if you're the American taxpayer, that since you have a dedicated source of revenue there, that over time, you would not be asked to pay the 10% cost share that Maryland would have to bear?
Just, I
So
think
make
there's
the argument there.
Sure. No, I think there's some other factors here. One is we are losing revenue now, right? And we'll
Right.
continue to lose that revenue through the next 4.5 years, you know, is what we're projecting right now. So we're losing those dollars now. The other part of that is, in effect, we are costing businesses and people every day by the delay of this bridge being built, by any delay, potential delay of this bridge being built. So all those are added costs that, in effect, we're trying to cover now so that we can get this bridge done as quickly as we can.
So are you telling me that the state of Maryland now, I know I'm over my time, but I think this is really the crux of the, I don't even want to say it's a disagreement so much, but is to try to figure out the best way to do this, is that the cost that the state of Maryland is bearing now should also play into what Maryland should bear in terms of the rebuild of the bridge?
No, I guess what I'm saying is that the insurance comes to $350 million.
Right.
So that's supporting it. There is a burden.
That will go back to the emergency.
Sure, but getting back
Right.
to the larger issue of the scale of this project and the impacts of it, there's this other impact that we are going through now with the loss of revenues for the toll authority for the next several years.
Okay. And I would just say that we have the rollout of all of the projects that have, where there's been a waiver granted of the 10% or 20% cost share. So I think this would probably be useful to submit to the committee for the record. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Capito, and I think your questions are extremely important, so thank you for the manner in which you have presented this. First, for Administrator Batt, I agree with you. It is the issue of the scope and scale. This tragedy on the Francis Scott Key has been characterized as being the largest maritime claim in history. So when you talk about scope and scale, Is this sort of off the charts?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. I mean, I think, you referenced in your testimony the video that we saw. I think that you don't see, we have a lot of issues with bridges, and in the country, we rarely see a collapse of this size of structure. And so, yes, it will be the largest maritime claim. And so, from a precedent standpoint, it is unprecedented.
So I just hope that puts somewhat to rest the difference between this tragedy and emergency relief funding versus a lot of the others that are nowhere in this category whatsoever. But this is much closer. Well, this exceeds Minnesota, but it exceeds even some of the worst emergency circumstances that we've had. So let me get to Senator Capito's point in regards to the tolls and tolls offset. First, you raised an interesting point that the bridge will be rebuilt and there will be tolls coming from it, and that the state benefits from that new facility. But I would point out that all of the emergency relief programs, the economies locally benefit from the federal government's resources that are put in. When you dealt with Hurricane Irma and you rebuilt the infrastructure and community, the businesses got back up quicker, sales tax increase, revenues increased, local governments did well, states did well. That's what it's all about, is getting your economy back to scale. So in regards to the toll revenues, and I'll repeat this again because I want to make sure, Secretary Wiedefeld, you have a chance to respond on this. The overwhelming expenses, as I understand it, is the operations of these facilities, not the infrastructure cost itself. Am I right on that? Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, the operating costs, particularly labor cost, are a significant part of any budget for the toll authority.
And we have how many toll facilities in Maryland?
We have 9.
9. So this is one of 9. And these revenues will be lost for a substantial period of time. And when we say lost, let me just point out to the members of the committee, there are alternatives to paying a toll to act through this area. You can go through city streets, which is the worst example, because you're going to go through neighborhoods, beating up roads dramatically with these trucks, interfering with communities. But that is one option. Another option is to go around the Beltway where there's no tolls. That's going to probably be the preferred option for the larger vehicles that can't go through the tunnels anyway. They don't pay any tolls doing that. So there's a significant part of the traffic that will avoid paying tolls for the next couple years, costing the toll facilities those revenues that were projected. Now, do you have a way of recovering that?
No. So it's adding cost to us because as that traffic moves on the Beltway, that increases our operating costs. So for instance, we have put emergency response units out there because the slightest hiccup in the system has an exponential impact on congestion up and down the Northeast Corridor. So we put in operating costs for that. We're anticipating higher maintenance costs due to the heavier traffic because these are the oversized vehicles and any hazardous materials now have to take this 25-mile detour on the Baltimore Beltway. So those are all additional costs that we now will incur for several years, 4+ years.
And they're not under the emergency relief
No.
recoveries. That's using your normal transportation revenues, how you obtain them through the user fees, et cetera, in the state of Maryland. And I guess the last point on this is that additionally, the state of Maryland is going to incur considerably more expenses, and the recoveries, 100% of the recoveries related to the bridge are returned to the emergency relief fund, are they not?
Yes, they are.
So the federal government's not going to pay 100%. They're going to pay 100% less the recoveries. And the recoveries are not only insurance, they're third-party claims.
Right.
And those third-party claims, I admit, it's going to take years before we uncover that. But there is at least a very serious evidence that there could be wrongdoing in the manner in which the vessel was handled, which could bring in substantial funds. That will go to the Federal Emergency Relief Fund, as it should. So I don't want to leave with the impression that the federal government is paying 100%. They're not going to pay 100%. They're going to get the recoveries. And the recoveries will far exceed the 10%. So as a matter of the burdens to the state of Maryland, in a manner in which the state of Maryland is complying with the requirements of the code as it relates to toll facilities, that's not something that is it's not allowed. We're complying with all the requirements. It would be, I think, just a terrible precedent if we start to try to figure out the values of the emergency relief funds to the local governments that are benefiting from this, from all emergencies, because each one is different. This clearly complies with any standard on the scope of the tragedy and should be reimbursed at 100%. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Ricketts.
Thank you, Senator Capito and General Spellman, Administrator Batt. Great to see you again. Secretary Wiedefeld, welcome.
Thank you, sir.
I want to offer my condolences as well to all Marylanders and especially the families and the loved ones of the 6 workers who lost their lives in this terrible tragedy, and also thank the first responders who acted so quickly to prevent further loss of lives and then, of course, responded after the bridge collapse. So we do have a lot of heroes in our communities that respond to these things, and we need to recognize the work they do. And of course, this is maintaining the nation's infrastructure is a key priority for what we do in the federal government, and the bridge in general is something that has been pointed out as a key part of our economy. In fact, talking to a small business owner in Omaha, Nebraska, he was talking about how he was having his product being shipped out through the Port of Baltimore, and obviously the bridge collapse impacted that, and he had to find another way to be able to ship. He was actually exporting his product overseas, so it was, trying to get there was not an easy task. So we know that this is an important thing. It's also important that we make sure that we get the information so that we can share that with the American taxpayers and make sure that this is done correctly. That's part of our job and oversight here. So, Administrator Batt, I'll just start with you just on some of the things that Senator Capito said, just to make sure that you agree with that. So, again, I know this is still early days, so I'm not going to come back and hold you to the penny on this, but do you agree with the estimate? It's about $1.7 billion to replace the bridge?
Yes, Senator, thank you for that. That is what we believe is consistent.
Great. And then we've established, and I think you agree, $350 million in insurance?
Yes, that is the current insurance policy.
Okay, so, and we've also talked about maybe some of the litigation claims. Senator Capito said $350 million. Do you have any sort of estimate on that?
I'd have to defer to DOJ, who is leading the claim. Hard to tell.
Have they said anything about $350 million? Because I think that's what Senator Capito said.
No, I think that was more of a guesstimate.
I'll just clarify what I said. I just kind of threw that
You
number
just threw that out there? Okay, great.
so I could get to an even $1 billion.
All right, great. Okay, well, okay, good. I'm glad that's a good thing to know. Secretary Wiedefeld, do you have any additional information to share on what the claims could potentially be?
No, sir, no, Senator. But we also obviously we have number of attorneys that we've hired to go after those dollars as well.
All right, so I had a conversation with Governor Moore. I very much appreciate him giving me a call to talk about this. And he really described this as kind of a financing thing that we would get reimbursed. But it sounds like, from what I hear, that maybe at the upper end of Senator Capito is accurate. We're talking about the federal government getting reimbursed for about $700 million, and having the federal government would pay for about $1 billion of this under Senator Cardin's plan. Is that accurate? Am I understanding this correctly?
So yes, under the ER law, all funds that are recovered through insurance or legal claims come back. And the Skagit Bridge in Washington, about $20 million, about $17 million of that came back 10 years later.
Okay, great. So also, my understanding is, Secretary Batt, that after the bridge collapsed, and this was after, you designated this as part of the interstate highway system. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay, so do you guys have the authority to do this? Is there any precedent for you as designating this after a disaster like this? Because it changes the cost share, right? It would change it from 80% to 90%. Is that accurate?
Yes, Senator, it would. And when I was a secretary in Delaware, I would drive on 695. It's signed as part of the interstate. I think we just all assumed it was part of the interstate. And so that was the first time that I've ever been part of redesignating it post an event, but it, for all intents and purposes, was part of the interstate. It was just related to its initial design exceptions back in the 1970s.
Okay, so, but you do think this is the first time that you've done this?
First time, to my knowledge, that we've done it after an event. We redesignate interstate all the time across.
So what would happen then to the toll fees? Does that change anything with regard to the toll fees and how Maryland uses it to designate as part of the interstate highway system?
So once they accepted the ER funds that federalized the facility, it would require any tolls to be used under Title 23.
So okay, so help me, for us regular civilians here who don't know what that means, what would that mean going forward for the state of Maryland? Because they've already talked about how they use this to maintain their toll system right now. What will happen going forward now that you've designated this?
So under Title 23, there are, there's a list of things that you must do. The first is maintain the bridge or the toll facility, so those funds can be used. And then after that, there are certain things that are allowable, all related to Title 23 highway expenses within the state.
So it's not going to impact Maryland's ability to be able to use those funds to continue to maintain their toll system. Is that accurate?
No, sir.
Okay, very good. I have other questions, but if we go to the second round, I'd like to get to those. If we don't, we can submit them in writing. Great, thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Ricketts. And who is next? Would it be Sheldon Whitehouse?
It would be.
Senator Whitehouse, you're on. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Good to have you all here. Thank you, Administrator Butt, for being here. Thank you also for your travels to Rhode Island. Maryland is not the only state that has a bridge predicament, as you know. Rhode Island's Washington Bridge goes over the Seekonk River. It carries a federal artery on it, where the Key Bridge runs about 30,000 vehicles per day. The Washington Bridge runs closer to 100,000 vehicles per day. And for the eastern half of my state, it's the essential artery for getting, for instance, to the hospitals of Rhode Island, to the Rhode Island Hospital emergency room, for instance. So it's very important to us to get this attended to with as much federal support as we can. I understand that we are looking at what the causes are of our bridge's failure to see whether it can qualify for emergency designation. And thankfully, our failure was caught before the collapse of the bridge. We just had to close it immediately, at least most of it. But we are where we are as a result, and it's going to be important to me and to Rhode Island's delegation to make sure that we are not exactly in Maryland's position, because we are probably not an emergency, and we thankfully did not have loss of life, but to be on the similar track of federal attention. So we've said that to you before. Governor McKee has said that to you. Our whole delegation has said that to you. This is not news to you, but since you are here, I wanted to remind you of that and ask if you had any comments to that point you could make.
Thank you, Senator, and I am well aware, both through my visits and our numerous conversations, of the importance and the impact to Providence, East Providence, and the entire state. I actually flew into Providence when I was on my way up to visit the Cape Cod bridges, just so I could see how things were going. Good to see that because of the efforts of Rhode Island DOT, that some of the
flow is better.
The flow is better. We'll continue to work with Rhode Island on this. Grateful that it was caught before it became a deadly disaster, and commitment to just stay in close contact as we move forward on this.
Yeah, and it's close contact is nice, but the request is that we stay on a time track similar to the Key Bridge project, and that there be significant resources available. We are dealing with a very significant expenditure for the state of Rhode Island for a really essential piece of federal infrastructure. I mean, you landed at T.F. Green Airport and you drove north on 95, and then you turned across the bridge to 195 in order to get to Cape Cod. All of eastern Massachusetts is accessed through that multi-lane highway which goes over that bridge. So it's really important, not just to Rhode Island, but also to those seeking to get to eastern Massachusetts and to the Cape and so forth, to have that bridge repaired. And the expense is going to be considerable. Looks like we're going to have to tear a significant portion of the bridge down and then commission a rebuild of a new structure. I don't think we're going to hit 1.7 billion, but it's going to be a big number, and it's going to be a particularly big number for a small state. We think it's important that it's a value that Rhode Island adds to have that junction of 95 and 195 right in the middle of our state. It's a very important piece of the federal infrastructure of the entire Northeast. And now that it has been put in this peril, we're really eager to make sure that the federal government understands that this federal highway needs federal support so that we can get it back in full, safe operation for another 50 to 100 years.
Yes, sir, I fully agree with you. I understand the impacts, and I think as Ranking Member Capito said, if this was in any one of your states, you would make this argument, so I hear you. I know that they just had an RFP that was out there to get a repair on the bridge that did not ultimately have any companies competing, so going to continue to work with Rhode Island DOT to get that bridge open as quickly as possible, and we'll meet with you on the as much funds as are legally eligible.
The funding is going to be key, and the timing of the funding is going to matter. Thank you very much, Chairman.
You're quite welcome. Sorry I had to step out. One of the issues that's of great interest to this committee is permitting. And we're having a hearing in another committee, Homeland Security Committee, on permitting. And I needed to be in two places at one time. And I thank Senator Capito for and Ben here to keeping things moving. And I'm going to ask a question, if I can, General Spellman, if I may. Federal and state agencies, including the Corps, came together quickly. I think that's really an understatement, quickly, to coordinate a timely multi-agency response to the bridge collapse. The results were impressive. They were beyond impressive. They were, like, I think, amazing. And I continue to applaud the efforts of all who participated and pulled together to respond to the disaster that occurred. That said, the federal government learns lessons from every emergency response experience that can be applied to future emergencies. My question, General Spellman, if I may, from the Corps' perspective, what are some of the key takeaways from the recovery and salvage effort that could help the federal government think maybe more strategically about emergency response moving forward? And looking back, what do you think went particularly well, and what do you think might have gone better? I like to say everything I do, I know I can do better. And maybe what have we learned, and what could we have done better?
Yes, sir. First, I wanted to just say thank you for those generous words. In terms of best practices, I'll just mention two items. First is the importance of authorities that Congress gives to us. I'll mention emergency reprogramming authority that you give the Chief of Engineers. It comes in Section 101 every year of our Energy and Water Appropriations Act. And then for the Navy, the Salvage Facilities Act. All of those allowed us to move fast on this. So within a couple of hours of the bridge coming down, Colonel Pinchason was able to exercise those authorities and our interagency agreements, and we had tools and people ranging from New York, New Jersey, all the way from Galveston, Texas, sailing toward Baltimore. Incredibly helpful. The second one I'll mention, sir, is leadership. And as you know, within hours, the president called me on this, and his team stayed in touch throughout. The Secretary of Defense called me that morning.
Did you say the president called you?
I'm sorry, sir.
Did you say the president called you?
Yes, sir, on my cell phone.
Does he call you often?
Not too often.
How did he get your number? Go right ahead.
Sir, Governor Moore was absolutely open to us and shared with us anything that we needed. I was to call him personally. And there were things we needed from Maryland, and we got it right away. I would just say having that level of access and that commitment, absolutely critical. I think one of the lessons we continue to learn, we continue to work hard on this, is during times like this when things are moving fast, always working to speak in precise and our best plain English. I said something about midway through this that caused some friction in the state, and certainly with the families. At the time, we still had 2 missing workers. I was asked in a national media interview how we were going to take the remaining section of span 18 off of the dolly. I said we were going to use explosives. And what those families heard and what the governor's team heard was I was going to go out and create a mushroom cloud in the Patapsco River. That's not what we meant. And we had a fluent Spanish speaker on our team, a young Army captain who put together an animation, translated it in Spanish, and we took that to the families and then the governor's team to help clean that up. But I think we could always do better speaking to Congress, to the administration, and to the public in plainer English.
Thanks very much. I have a question for Secretary Wiedefield. And Mr. Secretary, the bridge that we're talking about here, like many active bridges in the United States, was built, I think, prior to the 1990s, if I'm not mistaken, and lacked adequate safety features to protect against a ship collision. Some older bridges, like the Delaware Memorial Bridge, that connects our state and New Jersey, are adding systems like protective islands that'll protect the bridge from ship collisions. And however, many older bridges still lack such protection. My question is, how is Maryland incorporating more robust collision protection into the design of the replacement bridge? Is the state contemplating whether to add that type of protection for other bridges, like, for example, the Chesapeake Bay Bridge? Please.
In terms of the replacement of Francis Scott Key Bridge, that'll be a key component of the future design of how do we do that, whether it's through islands or actually moving the piers further apart. As you may recall, within short distance of the 700 foot, it goes very shallow very quickly. If you remember, we opened these auxiliary lanes, and they were like anywhere from 10 to 20 feet deep. So if you put these piers much further apart, obviously that's a natural protection. So that's in the replacement. So that'll be played out through the design as a high priority. In terms of other bridges that we own, Chesapeake Bay Bridge, we're looking at both immediate things that we can do, operation, and then longer term, which obviously we would have to go through a series of permitting and different things of that sort to build anything around those existing piers. We also have a study underway to replace those bridges, and that would in fact be the same thing, where we would look at how do we protect them for a future bridge.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much. Senator Berkeley, you're next. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, and Secretary Whitfield, thoughts go out to all the people in Maryland affected by this bridge disaster, lost lives and affected families. And certainly the infrastructure bridge programs we have are so important as we seek to prevent future events. And Administrator Bott, Congress has not acted on the disaster supplemental request submitted by the administration back in October of last year and updated just last month. The updated requests include additional $3.1 billion in funding for the .ER program, or Emergency Relief Program, and $4 billion for other certain disaster needs, including the Key Bridge and wildfires. How important are these disaster supplemental requests?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. I think every state takes some comfort from knowing that if they are impacted by a disaster, the ER program is there. And I think one of the challenges for us now is that as we project the next 6 months, we're likely to have more requests for reimbursement than we have funding available. So that supplemental timing is critical.
I heard the word critical. I'll emphasize that, the importance of us acting in that regard. The event with the Francis Scott Key Bridge and a few other disasters around the country really focused on bridge infrastructure. Out in the Pacific Northwest, we talk about the Cascadia Subduction Zone event. The Cascadia Subduction Zone faults that extend over 1,000 miles that ruptures every 300 years or so. The current estimate is there's a 37% chance in the next 50 years of, more colloquially, the big one. And the big one will make bridges that connect across the Willamette River, Columbia River, other key waterways essential in getting emergency supplies. So in that regard, folks in Oregon really love the Bridge Investment Program. but of course it's oversubscribed. To what degree do we need to strengthen our existing bridges to prepare for a 1 out of 3 plus chance of a big one in the Pacific Northwest?
Thank you, sir, for that question. Yes, we've received a lot of interest in the bridge program. I want to thank this committee for including seismic retrofit as an eligibility. So the Golden Gate Bridge is actually one of the first bridges to receive $400 million for seismic retrofit. So yes, I've been out to Portland. I've been on the Columbia River Bridge and a bunch of others, and yes, they are in dire need of investment.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Merkley. Senator Kelly, you're next. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. Administrator Batt and General Spellman, as I understand it, one of the contributing factors to this catastrophic failure of the Francis Scott Key Bridge was the lack of fenders on the bridge itself, which protect a bridge or a pier from the damage from a possible vessel strike in the case of a vessel losing control or just poor navigation. Can you both speak to whether your agency maintains data on which bridges in the United States have this protective infrastructure in place and which ones do not?
Sir, we don't have the data, but I would just add to your comment. This bridge was completed in 1977. The Neo-Panamax type vessels like the Dolly showed up in our waterways 40 years later. And so the concrete dolphins that were out there protecting Pier 17 and 18 and the fendering were clearly not sufficient for vessels of that size.
And do you feel this situation exists in other places?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. That has been a key focus for us since the FSK disaster. There's about 620,000 bridges in our national bridge inventory. About 4,000 of those, give or take, have, as part of the inspection process, we require states to look at the dolphins and fenders and other pieces. We are working with AASHTO and the NTSB right now to get that full inventory looked at to see which bridges have the up-to-date protection and what can be done in order to bring them up to speed and up to code.
And if we are able to bring them up to code and install protective measures like these fenders, is it possible for the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund to be the source of funding to do that?
Happy to look into that and see if that, in addition to the Highway Trust Fund, would be an appropriate source of funding.
Senator Kelly, I'd have to do the research. I'm not familiar. We could use that authority.
In general, at this point, how would you prioritize these type of investments over other infrastructure projects that you have going on?
Yes, sir. I think they have to receive the highest priority. And in fact, I think in the Corps, we have to do a better job in our chiefs reports that we send to Congress in doing a better job in definitizing the importance of maritime safety and the impact. So, for example, today we have harbors, major harbors in the country where they don't have a 700-foot channel. They have a 500-foot channel for vessels of these size, and they're not going to get any wider. For example,
what's the beam on this vessel?
Sir, just under 150 feet.
150. Okay.
And we're not going to make them wider because in some of the ports, they can't afford the cost of the coral mitigation. So we have that. And so, again, I think it's on the Corps and our engineers to do a better job in definitizing the safety aspect of these bridges so we can get to better economic ratios in our reports.
It may have come up before I came in, but how far along is the mishap investigation here?
Sir, that would be up to the NTSB.
So you don't have a timeline for when it
We're
would be
working with
completed?
them, but they control the investigation.
Do you know if part of the investigation was to see if there have been other close calls throughout the country that we may not have been aware of?
Senator, I would want to defer to the NTSB on what they're looking at.
Sir, I would just, in their preliminary report that they released in mid-May, they mentioned that they are looking at other bridge collapses, one in Tampa, Florida, Oklahoma, and Texas, to look at the protective measures, the dolphins and the fendering systems, and what can we take from the new bridges at those locations and bring forward to modernize our current inventory.
It'd be interesting to know, and I don't think you guys would have the info either. I think it might be something for the Maritime Administrator, somebody else in the Department of Transportation, how often we've had situations where, ships have, lost steering, maybe had to go to aft steering, which is a challenging thing to maneuver a ship, especially in close quarters, when you're required to, go to a guy who's, basically at the back of the vessel in the engine room, and you're talking to him over a radio. But it would be interesting to have that data as part of an investigation to see, what is the likelihood that this could happen again. And I think that could possibly inform the priority you make on infrastructure investments. Like, do we really need to get, these fenders and other mitigation measures installed? So thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You bet. Thanks much, and thanks for those questions. Administrator Bott, General Spellman, as we discussed earlier, the Key Bridge is only one of many bridges in the United States that lack functional pier protection. That list also includes bridges near major ports like New York, like Philadelphia, like New Orleans. And Administrator Bott, what is the Federal Highway Administration doing to better protect the bridges across our country that still lack adequate pier protection? I have a follow-on to that, but just start with that. What is the Federal Highway Administration doing now to better protect bridges across our country that still lack adequate pier protection?
Thank you, Chairman Carper. Obviously, it's an incredibly important question. We have been in close contact with AASHTO, the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials, just to get a better understanding of how many bridges are have exposure to vessels of this size. We are making them aware of all of the funding opportunities, both in the formula and discretionary grant programs. I will say the Bridge Large program, or the Bridge program, the Bridge Improvement Program, is obviously oversubscribed. We do have a funding shortfall, so it's both identifying the needs that are out there and then finding funding priority to address those needs. And we're going to continue to work closely with the NTSB as they provide their recommendations as to what the appropriate level of protection. As we know, there were dolphins on this bridge, but we're not successful in protecting the Francis Scott Key Bridge.
All right. Thank you. General Spellman, looking back on the disaster, what are some of the major safety measures that the Corps would recommend taking while the Federal Highway Administration and Congress work together on addressing this safety concern?
Yes, sir. And I think we will take the lead of the National Transportation Safety Board. As I mentioned, their report that they released in mid-May, the bulk of that report talked about the vessel and the electronics, but there is a section in the back on bridge safety and resilience against collisions that we had here. Everything from fendering and larger and more dolphins. Those are the large concrete cylinders that you saw during your visit that we anchor into the bottom of the river to protect those important piers. I think as we do what we call our Section 408 reviews for new bridges and navigation channels, that we in the Corps have to take a harder look at those safety measures and work with our state and federal partners to make sure that they are in fact implemented.
Okay, thank you. Secretary Wedefield, a question I could on air quality impacts. And the question is, last month when we met with Governor Moore, who I must say is a very impressive leader, I have several opportunities to meet with him, and very impressed. But when we met with the governor with the lieutenant governor at the site of the bridge collapse, during that meeting, we discussed, as you may recall, some of the impacts that the bridge collapse may be having on people who live in the surrounding communities, impacts including trucks, a lot of other vehicles that have been rerouted through people's neighborhoods. We talked about the effect that can have on congestion, the effect that it can have on safety. I'd add probably the effect it could have on air quality. We also discussed the potential for increased air pollution from the trucks that serve the port. My question is, what is the state of Maryland doing to monitor and if necessary, mitigate the effects of increased truck traffic through the neighborhoods close to the port?
Yes, thank you, Senator. We're working directly with the local governments, meaning Baltimore City, Baltimore County, and Anne Arundel County, which you get the immediate community impacts, to make sure we're monitoring any truck traffic, policing it where they should be and where they shouldn't be, and then working with the community to deal with their basic transportation needs, because the inability just to get across to another part of the city and the county with now the short path of the bridge. So we're working with that. We're working with our transit administration to look at opportunities there as well as travel demand management. We're also working with the Metropolitan Planning Organization to monitor the air quality, and with our Maryland Department of Environment to monitor that. Obviously, that goes eventually into the state implementation plan on the air quality side. But if there's any immediate hot spots in effect, so that we can address those, we've been very successful with the trucking community, obviously, to make sure they understand the implications of that and to work with us. And so that has been working very well, and we'll continue those efforts.
Very good. Just a follow-up question, if I could, is there any assistance that you and your colleagues need from the federal government to address air quality impacts resulting from the traffic effects of
Not
the
at this
bridge's collapse?
time. Again, I think the open communication that we're having with the community, meaning both the people that live in the area, the businesses that are dependent upon the highway system in that area, the trucking, the port, as long as we keep those lines of communications open, I think we can keep tackling these issues head on.
All right, thanks. Senator Capito, would you like to go next or yield to Senator?
Yeah, I'll yield to Senator Ricketts.
All right, thanks. Senator
Great.
Ricketts.
Thank you very much, Senator Capito. Appreciate that. So I want to change gears a little bit to talk about the permitting of this, because it's important that we get this done as quickly as possible. I think we all recognize that. So Administrator Bott and General Spellman, there has been precedent in this administration to use alternative arrangements to waive NEPA and other environmental regulations to build projects for emergency response. The administration used alternative arrangements to waive the NEPA and bypass standards of the standard compliance process to establish the emergency migrant housing encampment in Floyd Bennett Field, the 1,450-acre National Park Service facility in New York City. And they did that in less than 2 weeks. So does this administration plan to use alternative arrangements to rebuild the Francis Scott Key Bridge?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. I'm not aware of waiving NEPA. What we will do is we will issue a categorical exclusion, because we're replacing a bridge in essentially the same footprint as the pre-existing one, and we'll work with the Corps and other resource agencies to get that done.
And so how much time do you think that will save to do the categorical exclusion?
98% of our projects are categorical exclusion, so it's a very quick determination.
And does this only have to be used, can it only be used in emergency situations?
No, the vast majority of our projects that are within an existing highway footprint are categorical exclusions. Is when you get into an EIS, environmental impact statement, or an EA, an environmental assessment, where you just have more impacts and more study is required.
Okay, so, because I was actually just talking to a gentleman who represents the iron workers, and he was describing to me a situation, and we'll get to more details to follow up with you on this, but in Chicago, where they were just replacing a bridge, and he said it took like 9 years to get the permit on that, and obviously I don't have all the details on that. But theoretically, that could be used for a categorical exclusion too, right? That if it's just replacing a current bridge that's already there, you could use a categorical exclusion to save a lot of the time when trying to get the permit. Is that accurate?
Happy to follow up with you, Senator, on those specific examples. A lot of it just has to do with the, I'll use the Cape Cod bridges as an example. Like there are whales in the canal that the Cape Cod bridges cross, and so there's an environmental impact on endangered species that could have an impact. So it just depends on the context of the bridge.
Okay. And then you said that you didn't have any knowledge of ways that you can waive NEPA. Is that accurate?
Again, waiving NEPA is not something that
You can't do that.
I don't believe I have the authority to do that, but we can find ways through a categorical exclusion when we're replacing a bridge that existed in that footprint in an emergency relief program expenditure.
But even though you said it didn't have to be emergency to use the categorical exclusions.
Correct.
Okay. And then I want to go back to another question I asked earlier. When you changed the designation for the bridge to the interstate highway system, under what authority did you do that?
under the authority of the Federal Highway Administration. Like, there's a process that we follow where the state says, we'd like this redesignated. It happens quite a bit, and we have to go through and say, here are the design exceptions that we would approve. So it's, I would assume it's under Title 23.
So, but there's a process. Did you follow that process for the Francis Scott Key Bridge?
Absolutely.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Cardin.
Senator Ricketts, I want you to, I think Secretary Whitfield is also taking steps to streamline the timeline on the replacement of the bridge. To give you a chance to respond on that.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, obviously, working with Federal Highway literally daily on this issue to make sure that we're hitting all the environmental issues, and then basically anything we can do on the design to get this done quicker. So we have put out the RFP, as was mentioned, roughly 2 months after the fall of the bridge. We have gotten the responses to those, and we're reviewing those now. The next phase will be we will hire a general engineers contractor, basically, in effect, the engineers to oversee this. That will go out in the next few weeks, and we'll have that decision late summer. And then we've also in process what we call the CMI, which is the construction management inspection portion of the future bridge. So we're doing that contract now. We're preparing that contract now, and we'll have that in early fall. All this is the stage to get this done as quickly as possible, given the significant impact it has on the local community and the Northeast Corridor.
I saw the team at work and what they did to get the port opened earlier than anyone anticipated. I have a great deal of confidence in Secretary Wiedenfeld and Governor Moore. We're going to get that bridge put up as quickly as possible because we recognize the significance not only to our state but to the entire country of that bridge being replaced quickly. So that is one of our principal focuses, do it right, but to do it as quickly as possible. Let me just take my remaining minute or two, General Spellman. I just really want to acknowledge again the extraordinary work of your team. I would like to include in that the Coast Guard. They were just incredible. The way that you have talent and commitment, the way that you immediately responded, the way that you brought in the private sector where you needed the private sector for their expertise. It was a team effort. And I can't underscore enough that when we saw the situation on March 26, we thought that port would be closed for a long time. And within a matter of weeks, you had shipping channels effectively opened for a large percentage of the traffic. Admittedly, it was difficult to get the ships in and out. They had to be by schedule and only could go in one direction. They couldn't have two ships at the same time. But we were able to get business started much, much faster than we ever anticipated. And then within a matter of a little over 2 months, we had the full channel opened. And that was incredible with the tonnage and the steel and the concrete that was there. And once again, I want to underscore this. I was there at the scene looking at the divers that you already complimented. They could not see their hands in front of them. And there's jagged debris out there that could be fatal to a diver. And they're operating under those extremely dangerous conditions, under some very bad weather conditions in early April, I might tell you. And then every time you moved any of the debris, you had to resurvey because debris would shift and would affect the safety of the divers. And you did it with complete safety and speed. And that's a resource that I must tell you, yes, you have the talent, but you also have the commitment of those that serve at the Army Corps and our Coast Guard and the private sector that put together this team. So I just really wanted to say once again, thank you so much for your incredible service for your team.
Thanks, sir. And I will certainly pass those words on to all those men and women wearing hard hats out there cutting up that steel, and certainly the divers. Incredible talent that the Navy and their industry partners brought to this.
I just have one quick follow-up question from General Spillman. Let's see, you said the Corps spent approximately $65 million for wreckage removal and emergency This came from annual operations and maintenance funding for the Port of Baltimore and through the use of the Corps' Emergency Reprogramming Authority. However, this supplemental transmitted to Congress only asks for $33 million for the Corps. Why is the supplemental request only for 33 when the Corps spent 65? And will the 33 million only be used to replenish annual operations and maintenance funding for the Port of Baltimore?
Yes, ma'am, let me explain. Our initial estimate to clear the 700-foot by 50-foot deep channel was $100 million. We're going to land that, we're in final demobilization now. It's going to come in at about $74 million. So we started off, we used $52 million from Baltimore Harbor, O&M, to not remove sediment, but to remove steel and concrete. And then I mentioned in my opening statement, we went out and canvassed unused and aged Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund O&M dollars from 220 projects across the nation, and we garnered $33 million to put against that effort. Okay. So I don't need the full, it's part of the supplemental request. We want to award, we have sediment further up the channel that we now have to deal with, and we're asking for $33 million to recoup what we spent on steel and concrete, and that will allow us to, if we get that near the end of this fiscal year, that'll allow us to stay on award for our next dredging contract, which we would like to award in October.
All right, thank you. Thank you all very much.
Senator Ricketts, any more questions? No, okay. With that, let me say in closing, thank you to each of you for preparation, for your presence and your response to questions. In some cases, you'll be asked some additional questions, as you know. I believe that the federal government can and should work certainly with states, with local governments, and the private sector to help us build the infrastructure and rebuild the infrastructure that we need to be a successful nation in the 21st century. And not only in Baltimore and in Maryland, but across our nation. For some final housekeeping, I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record a variety of materials that relate to today's hearing, including letters from stakeholders. Senators will be allowed to submit questions for the record through the close of business on July 24th. We will compile those questions, and we're going to send them on to each of you as appropriate. And we're going to ask you to reply to those questions by August the 7th. Senator Capito, any other thoughts? I'm good. I just want to thank our staffs on both sides of the aisle for their work in the preparation for today. We thank our witnesses as well. It's been a constructive hearing, and we look forward to moving on and figuring out the right thing to do and doing our dead level best to do that. And to keep in mind what was that, the golden rule, treat our neighbors the way we want to be treated. All right, with that, I think this hearing is adjourned. All right.